So with that, I will hand it over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Thanks for setting this up, and to Jean Hill for managing the Zoom recording. Really appreciated, really helpful. So today I'll be talking about community-based participatory action research for post-prison higher ed. Before I get started, there are a few community partners that I want to thank as well. So first, thanks to the University of Washington Tacoma for supporting this work. It's funded through the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. I also want to thank the Freedom Education Puget Sound, which is a local prison education program for women, and they're also starting up some reentry pathways support. I also want to thank the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, particularly Brian Walsh from SBCTC, who's been instrumental in helping me get connected locally in Washington. And then lastly, I want to thank three individuals, Al Ratcliffe, Omari Amili, and Gillian Harkins. Al's on the call today. He's been really helpful in getting situated here in Tacoma and developing relationships with community partners. Omari Amili is a formerly incarcerated graduate of UW Tacoma who was courageous enough to share his story broadly while he was on campus, and I think really opened the door to my work here. And then Gillian Harkins, who's helped me get situated within the University of Washington system. So first I want to talk about, so there are a few different things that I'll talk about today. First, I'll talk about the need for post-prison higher education research. Then I'll talk about a method for conducting community research and why this method strengthens research. I'll talk about the strengths and limitations of this method, some of the ancillary benefits of CBPAR, and then implementation for prison and post-prison education transitions. So first, why I do this work. If we look at the data on the mass incarceration in the United States, our rates of incarceration here eclipse all other industrialized countries. It's particularly true for racial minority citizens who are 2 to 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than people who identify as white. We also see educational inequity in the system. People who are incarcerated have 1/5 of the rate of post-secondary degrees at about 11% compared to the general population. So we see the educational inequity, yet we also see in the research that education is one of the most powerful tools for reducing recidivism. A meta-analysis by RAND showed that people who have completed post-secondary education were 40% less likely to recidivate compared to those who didn't. So we know that education can be important for reducing recidivism and helping people transform their lives. However, there's a considerable dearth of research on post-prison higher education. If we look at the totality of this research, there are fewer than 10 studies that have ever been conducted on post-prison higher education research, despite the potential for such education. That research does suggest that there are various different promotional factors that we might want to look at, including social support, privacy about people's background, a desire for change and for higher education, and resilience. That research also suggests various different barriers, such as having a label of being an ex-convict or a convict or previously incarcerated, stigma surrounding that label, people's reactions because they have that stigma, people's own individual reactions, their self-beliefs about who they are and what they're capable in life because of that label that they have. Also, skill and knowledge about how to disclose one's background, when to disclose one's background, application boxes on applications that force people to disclose their backgrounds. Also, background checks for various different opportunities that come up in higher education, like internships. The environments that people are situated in outside of academia, for example, the home environments that are often the same environments that people were in whenever they were committing crimes and before they went to prison. And then lastly, some of the socioeconomic status and needs that come along with that from people that tend to be more likely to go to prison. And sometimes a lack of resources in meeting those needs. So we see from the research that there are various different promotional factors and barriers that can lead to either entry into education or barriers and lack of entry into education after prison. However, that's about all that we know, or that there are these broad factors that seem to be out there. The largest sample size in any of these studies, though, is 35 people, and there are considerable threats to both internal and external validity in each one of these studies. So we know that there's this lack of research in post-prison higher education, and so that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to really shape the field of post-prison higher education research. Oftentimes in community psychology, we're entering into fields that have already been heavily studied, and we're really trying to change the paradigm and change the directory of the research in those fields. However, this is essentially a blank slate in post-prison higher education research, so it's an opportunity to bring in CBPAR to reduce some of the biases and lack of usefulness that are often prominent in fields of study. So why engage in CBPAR? I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because the audience that I have here is probably already familiar with CBPAR. But if we think about what the goal of research is, it's to provide an objective, unbiased understanding of reality. But there's some various different challenges for reaching that goal. Some of these challenges are better examined and understood in research. Others aren't as well understood or examined. So for example, there are threats to internal validity and threats to external validity. And there are various different biases that create a distortion of reality about what we're finding. But there are also other challenges that are less examined in research methods inquiry. For example, research questions themselves are often biased. When I first started looking at reentry experiences, I started studying the role of hope in reincarceration. And believe it or not, only 2 other studies had ever examined the role of hope in reincarceration. Now, as being someone who has been incarcerated and has re-entered successfully, some might say, I immediately thought about the role of hope and how important that was in my own re-entry. But different people ask different questions, and people who haven't had certain experiences tend to ask different questions than people who have had those experiences. So the research questions themselves are inherently biased. And also the results that we get are interpreted by humans, and as such are biased by cognitive biases and other human biases that people have. So there's a biased interpretation of the results. The research bias, the research questions are biased in who asks them. Some are more useful than others. They're often asked from a researcher's perspective and not a practitioner's perspective, and so may not be as useful. The questions themselves may not be as useful. And often populations are portrayed as problematic by people who may be an outsider and may see another group, an outside group, as more of an object, as less than human, and may ask questions that tend to portray them as a problem and their experiences as problematic, and therefore may portray the population as problematic in that process. So as I mentioned earlier, the interpretation of results are often biased as well. Research on interpretation suggests that results tend to be interpreted based on the perspective of researchers. And if you bring different researchers together to examine results, they tend to interpret the same results differently depending on their academic perspective. So I'm going to pause here and for some questions. And I see that Carolyn had a question here about the stats on the benefits for education and recidivism. Unfortunately, the research on education tends to lump all education programs together, looking at the benefits of that programming. Are there other questions that people have about why CBPAR or the background on post-prison higher education research?
I have all kinds of questions. Figure I put my face back up. I was really intrigued by your statement that it sounds like a lot of the existing research on educational, I guess, benefits of education have small n's. I mean, I feel like I'm used to seeing criminological studies with these huge n's of very shallow data, and that we're making the argument that we need richer data. I was interested in your thoughts on the absence of that in this area.
Yeah, now on the prison education side, we have some pretty decent studies on the prison education. It's really on the post-prison education side where we have a considerable dearth of research. The impact factor of the journals, which certainly isn't the only indicator of quality of articles, but the impact factor of the best journal that post-prison and higher education research is published in is probably about 1.
Okay.
Factor, but if you look at the individual studies as well, of which we found 5. I've been a little conservative in saying fewer than 10, but we found 5 studies on post-prison education so far, and they all have considerable limitations to them. I mean, they're a great start, right? And we have to start somewhere in that inquiry, but it suggests that there's much more that needs to be done in that area.
Yeah, I mean, part of why I'm so interested in this is I work in juvenile settings where whether or not the kids are able to get a high school degree after they're released is kind of a big, outstanding question. And I think a barrier to doing that research is that the school and the juvenile justice system are totally separate systems with almost no integration of data for sure, but little communication as well.
Do you only work locally, or do you work outside?
Just locally, yeah, in Toledo.
The reason why I ask is I know in Washington we have we're actually one of the few states that has a centralized database of various different state entities. So we have one single database that includes post-secondary higher ed data and Department of Corrections data. And I wonder if our school data is under that same umbrella too, which I would assume it is, but we have one repository that manages all of the data together.
Sounds like a good exemplar.
So I'd be, if you want to know more about like how Washington is set up with the database management, I'd be happy to ask some people and sort of get a summary of that, and maybe that's something that Ohio could work on.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Other questions? So I'm going to move really briefly, especially through the CBPAR stuff, because I think people are fairly familiar with that. I do add the A in there, so I add the A in there intentionally instead of just CBPR, because I think sometimes CBPR is action research and sometimes it's not action research. But CBPAR is community-based, participatory, and action research. So it's community-based, and then it's research that's taking place in the community, outside of the lab, or in a single organizational setting. It's participatory, and that involves the target population and the research process in a meaningful way. And it's action research, in that it intersects with ongoing process. So it's a process in which the research is informed by practice, and then the results from the research then go on to inform practice that's taking place. So the CBPAR reduces bias in the research in a few different ways. One, it enhances external validity of the study or generalizability to the real world because it's taking place in the community outside of the lab. The participatory nature of CBPAR helps provide diverse perspectives, which can allow the research to answer salient and varied research questions and address some of those biases in the questions themselves. Also, the research design helps create research designs that are most relevant to target experiences by including the target population in the research design, and provides conflicting interpretation of the results. So by bringing multiple stakeholders to the table, we have multiple different interpretations of the results, which give us different perspectives and don't necessarily reduce the bias, but provide multiple competing biases that hopefully in the end balance one another out. Also, since it's action research, it helps reduce some of the biases around usefulness by providing opportunities for pragmatic and practical questions, and for providing pragmatic and practical solutions to some of those questions. So in summary, CBPAR reduces bias by providing opportunities for meaningful questions and answers, providing diverse and relevant perspectives, providing opportunities for practical solutions, and enhancing the generalizability to the real world. There are also some ancillary benefits with CBPAR. For example, CBPAR allows potential capacity building for people involved in the process. They can develop knowledge and skill around the research process itself. And it provides opportunities for people involved in the research to network with one another. CBPAR also provides opportunities or enhances research logistics and quality. So for example, CBPAR has been shown to enhance recruitment of participants and enhance response rates of those participants because of the involvement in the target population in the design process. For those reasons, we're using CBPAR to better understand prison to college transitions or prison to college research. So it's community-based in that we are examining people transitioning from colleges and university, transitioning from prison to colleges and universities in Pierce County. Sorry, we have a question there from Al. Has there been any study of the different patterns of research bias and the best practices for resolving bias differences? There have been some studies on researcher bias. So if we go back to a couple of these slides here, so if you go back to these slides, and these slides will be posted, I'll provide a website here in a moment on the slides. But the slides with the numbers have actually been studied on various different biases that researchers bring to the table. So anytime you see one of those numbers there, that's something that has been examined. However, the best practices for reducing those biases aren't nearly as well understood as the biases themselves. We have other questions on some of the biases involved in CBPAR. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward then. The Post-Prison Education Research Lab is using CBPAR to study transitions from prison to college. It's using a participatory process in that various different stakeholders related to the transition process are being assembled to be the research advisory board. So this includes the chair of a post-prison higher education advisory council. That advisory council is comprised of formerly incarcerated students and graduates that are helping develop a transition program at the University of Washington, Tacoma. The chair of that council sits on the advisory board. There are also two navigators from the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. Those navigators help assist people who are transitioning from prison to community colleges in the state. We don't have something similar yet for the university level, but they do assist people transitioning to community and technical colleges. We also have the executive director of a prison education program and reentry support program. That's the Freedom Education Puget program, Puget Sound, that I mentioned earlier in the talk. We also have the director of research for the Washington Student Achievement Council, which essentially is tasked with promoting access to higher education and success in higher education. There's a CEO of a workforce development organization in the state, an educational strategist, a social services community advocate, and the senior program associate at the Vera Institute for Justice. So this group overall was developed for the purpose of this research itself. Over the next 6 months, we'll engage in a process of capacity building, strategic planning, initial research conceptualization, and then submission of an award for that research. And then my expectation is that it will continue in the future. But it was intentionally developed for this work. So what I did when I arrived in Washington is identified some of the various different stakeholders that seem to be involved in the prison and post-prison education process, and then identified representatives of each one of those stakeholder groups. One more thing that I'll note, and then I can open up for questions about the advisory board itself. So also the project director, myself, is formerly incarcerated, and the project director hired to oversee this capacity building and process is a formerly incarcerated college student as well. Are there other questions about how the research advisory board has been developed?
I have a question. Can y'all hear me? I can't see myself, but am I coming through? Okay. I'm curious about the reentry navigators. So I know you mentioned that that's helping reentry into specifically community and technical colleges. Is that something that is funded by the state, or where does that position come from?
Yeah, so that is funded by the state. It's essentially a collaboration of the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, where the navigators are housed, and the Department of Corrections work closely with these reentry navigators. So those are placed at various different community and technical colleges around the state. They're not tied specifically to that college, that technical or community college, and that they can help people. They can help place people at any community or technical college around the state. However, they are housed within those and support people that are returning to communities in which those technical and community colleges serve.
Great, thank you.
Chris, are these navigators limited in what they help with to educational entry, or do they deal with the other social determinants of health?
They do provide referrals for other social determinants. So some are better than others. Some are more well connected to community service providers than others. They're primarily tasked with helping people transition into careers, and community and technical colleges are part of that. So there is a broader reentry navigator program, and this is a subset of that program that's specifically tasked with helping people do career transitions. However, they are often connected with social service providers and help connect people with those. But again, that's a little more varied in that it's not a systematic support process. It really varies by the individual.
Chris, forgive me if you already said this. I'm working from home and my dog started barking when you were presenting this slide. So could you talk a little bit about how you brought this group of folks together? So I know with like CBPR, many times the research question is something that's really crafted once you have the folks in the room together because of the extent to which you have participation really from the start to the finish. So I'm wondering, like, had you identified specific research questions or just kind of a general theme? Like, what do it look like to bring these folks together and then have them really engage in the process?
Yeah, great question. So currently, the only meeting we've had so far is a meet and greet meeting, a 2-hour meet and greet, where we've started to identify potential research questions, but we've really just kind of gotten the intellectual juices flowing at that meeting. We really haven't identified the research question that we'll examine yet. But so what we've done so far is had a meeting where we've all gotten to know each other a little bit, talked about what the process will be like. The next meeting will be a 6-hour strategic planning session where we'll identify the larger scope of the research over the next 5 years and what types of broad research questions we'll ask, and then more immediately with the next study, what specific research question we'll ask in the next study. So I think I have a slide coming up on this. So let me go ahead and maybe move into that slide, and then I can answer other questions, both about the research process and about the board. So the CBPAR used for this inquiry is action research, in that it's tied to Pierce County prison to college transition programs. So we're hoping to answer questions from existing and emerging programming, to answer questions for those programs, and also answer additional questions, also have additional questions and answers. The process for this research starts with organizing, learning, and prioritizing. So we have initial meetings so we have the coalition already organized. We'll do some capacity building about different research methods, and also provide summaries of literature on post-prison education transitions. Currently, we're in the process of strategic planning, where we're identifying longer-term goals of the research, longer-term, broader research questions and more immediate research questions that we'll prioritize. So we'll have a set of various different research questions and prioritize those in the logical sequence that helps build on one another. Then it will follow with a process of conceptualizing the research, gathering resources and data, and then implementing the research. So following the strategic planning, we'll have capacity building retreat that helps develop people's capacity for research methods that are aligned with the goals of the research that come from the advisory board. We'll then acquire resources. So my research team will identify potential funding resources. And actually the community advisory board has also started to identify potential sources for research funds that I wasn't aware of in the state. We'll also work together to collect the data. And then once we have that data, we'll work together to understand and share the results. So the community advisory board will help interpret the results of the data analysis, and will help communicate those results to various different stakeholders around the state and around the country. So in summary, PERL'S research, CBPAR research process starts with a general research question, factors that promote and hinder transitions from prison to college. So Jessica was asking about the research question. This is the only boundary that I have for the board right now, is that we are examining factors that promote or hinder transitions from prison to college. And I would probably even expand beyond that and to say research questions associated with prison to college, but primarily interested in factors that promote or hinder those transitions. We've developed a team of stakeholders that have a role in such transitions, and I've noted those earlier. The team has a meaningful role. It gets to decide what research questions to ask, how to get those answers, what the answers mean, and how to spread those answers to others. We're using the CBPAR process to provide more useful, stronger research for both academics and communities. Provides diverse perspectives on questions and answers, provides opportunities for meaningful questions and answers, provides opportunities for practical solutions, and enhances generalizability to the real world. It helps also build individual and community capacity for prison to college research. So that's in general the process of CBPAR, why we're using it, the team that's assembled, and what the process will be like for that team. So what other questions do you have about, specifically about the process that we haven't addressed so far?
What definition of stakeholders are you using?
Great question. So my definition of stakeholders is a bit broader than what's typically used for CBPAR. Usually with CBPAR, the community advisory boards are primarily comprised of people that have had the experience that's being studied. They probably give less emphasis to some of the more, I guess, traditional program directors of various different programs that are involved in whatever the target population is or whatever the process is. So typically, for example, for homelessness, the study of homelessness would probably primarily involve people that have had experiences with homelessness, and probably wouldn't involve program managers and program directors as much. However, I have given a little more emphasis to some of what might be considered outside stakeholders, primarily because I myself am formerly incarcerated and primarily embedded within networks of people who are formerly incarcerated and who are college graduates. So the perspective that I need to broaden myself on more is really the perspective of program directors, of directors of different agencies in the community, for example.
Okay.
So that's why I've broadened the definition of stakeholders to really include anyone who is associated with the prison to college transition process, people who touch that in different ways. probably the biggest gap on the committee right now is probably family members of people that have made those transitions. But the definition that I include in stakeholders is really anyone who comes into contact with that transition process.
Okay.
Other questions about the stakeholders or the process?
You caught my attention with the 6-hour strategic planning meeting. I'd be interested to hear your plans for that. I'm getting the impression that you have a kind of a leadership role within this group. I've been in groups like this where I was not in a leadership role, and I think it's a very different kind of experience. So I'd be interested to hear what your plans are.
Yeah, so I primarily tasked the project director with the development of the strategic planning process and implementation of that strategic planning process. So he's the facilitator for the meetings as well. And that allows me to step back a little bit, but not a lot. So I don't necessarily have somebody who is a stakeholder totally leading this process, which I think would remove my influence a little bit from that. So I think ideal situation, I would probably have somebody tasked with that. And maybe if I had more resources or a stronger community ties here where I could get someone to really commit to things a little more, I'd be able to do that. But the way I've done it to try to limit some of the power differential is by having the project director develop the process and then facilitate the process. And then during those meetings, then I do give my perspective during those meetings, but I wait until the end to give my perspective until various different stakeholders have provided their perspectives.
I see.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so I hear you saying you're kind of got an eye on power differentials, which makes sense. But I guess one experience that I've had that I found frustrating is I feel like as academics we're used to herding cats. You know, we're used to having a lot of people on the table with different views and trying to get everyone to kind of move in a direction. And in the absence of someone who's ready to do that, you know, we don't move in a similar direction.
Yeah, so I think so far, like I feel like it's a pretty good balance so far because I've assembled everyone and am overseeing this project director who has lived experience and also has experience in like project direction and facilitation, right? And so I was able to find somebody who had both of those assets, and sort of then I can be the one that's doing the cat herding, and then I can also reduce some of the power differential by backing away from the process itself, both outside of the meeting and within the meeting, I guess. So maybe that was a good thing. I guess I see it as maybe not the ideal situation. I think Carolyn's saying based on her experience that maybe it is an ideal situation.
I mean, I think if we look for the ideal situation, we're going to be looking a long time, but you know, definite pros and cons.
Chris, can you talk a little bit about what it took for you to get to this point? I think several people on the call maybe have more experience doing this work, but knowing there are people that frequently log on later and watch the video, like I think of students who are like, how did you do this? Because we kind of show up, but we tell the story starting where we have everyone in the room. But how long have you been working to get all these people to the table, and what did it take to do that?
Well, yeah, how long I've been working to get the people to the table is probably like that's a challenging question, because I think we work on getting people to the table before we actually like work on getting people to the table. So I think like I've worked probably for years in laying a foundation for this to be possible through my work in post-prison higher education in general. And I think work primarily outside of academia and organizing people around the country who are formerly incarcerated college graduates. And then before that, more locally in Chicago. And so what that helps do is it helps provide some credibility. I come into this with I think some credibility already by being a formerly incarcerated college graduate, and that certainly has helped the process. But also, you know, even for people that aren't formerly incarcerated college graduates or don't have lived experience in whatever topic they're studying, building a reputation and building credibility in that area of work before you begin the research can really help. But the more intentional process of building this advisory board began probably in, let's say, June of last year, so about a year ago, when I first learned that I had this position here. I started developing relationships then with people that were in Tacoma. So even before I moved here, I was starting to map out the area, which I'd done some obviously for the application here, but starting to map out the various different resources and needs of the area with an emphasis on the assets and what kind of people or what people were involved with those assets so for example, what kinds of prison and post-prison education programs there were. So I started doing that immediately. Al, I think I reached out to you once I moved here or right before I moved here, something like that. But that was really critical too, to have an ally in the area. So I could start reaching out to stakeholders before I moved here, but if you don't have a relationship already with those stakeholders, then it's harder to get them involved in something like this. And this certainly wasn't the first ask of them, right? The first goal of networking is really just to get to know people, to help identify their needs, to attend events that they're having so that you can start to build that relationship before you ever ask for a favor from them. But I started building those relationships before I came here, and then reached out to Al, developed a relationship with Al, and then I didn't really expect for Al to be as instrumental in connecting me with other stakeholders in the area, but that's actually been a key. He's been a key ally to have here. So I didn't necessarily do that intentionally, but finding someone who's well connected in the community and well respected in the community to help network with others is really important. And that's something that I've been fortunate to have in multiple different areas. But it started in June. Once I got in the ground in September, I started having meetings with people and immediately having coffee, having lunches with people, attending people's events. I'm really just getting to know people and what they did and who was a good fit with the values that I had. And also letting them evaluate my values and whether it was a good fit for their priorities. And then once I got to know the landscape a little better through those conversations, then starting to reach out to people intentionally, telling them what I was doing and getting them on board with getting them on the advisory board. The first ask, I would say the first casual ask for the advisory board was probably in December of last year. So I started networking in June, moved here in September, started having meetings with people in September. Then in December had the ask for people to be on the board. And the first official ask came in January when we started assembling the board. And then it was a few months of getting people connected and making sure to get other stakeholders that were identified by existing stakeholders. So we broadened the scope of the advisory board after getting other people on board, and then had our first meeting in May. So started recruiting in January, first meeting in May, and our final meeting will be in this December. So it'll essentially be a 1.5-year process to go from initial relationship building to what we expect will be a grant submission, and then a reflection on the process in December. So it'll be about a 1.5-year process. This is what we would consider the first cycle. Oftentimes in CBPAR, a cycle ends with reporting of results, and then you ask or implementation of results, and then you ask new questions. But here we're ending the first cycle with the submission of the grant so that we can reflect on the process and change it for data collection. Did that answer your question, Jessica?
Yeah, sorry, I felt a sneeze coming on. So do you think in December you'll plan to have that, like, will you invite them to stay? Because it is really interesting that, like, that's the end goal is the grant submission, and then planning to disband to some extent. Like, do you think you'll invite folks to stay on once the project gets started, depending on what shape it takes?
Yeah, I'll definitely invite them to stay on. My goal for this is that it will be a continuing, that the advisory board will operate in perpetuity. But I do want to give them that space after they've had a chance to work through a process with me of deciding whether this is a valuable experience for them, and also a chance to alter the process once we've sort of have had a deliverable and have had a chance to reflect on that deliverable. I didn't mention this earlier, but we have a manuscript that we're working on CBPAR and the implementation of CBPAR, this particular implementation. So we'll draft a manuscript and then submit that in December on what this initial process has looked like. And that will also give us a way to, a structured way to reflect on the process ourselves by documenting that process. Other questions?
Well, just a comment. Number one, you give me more credit than I think I deserve because you hit the ground running. And I connected you with a few people, but then I began to see you everywhere. So it wasn't me primarily, it was all of your work. But kind of in relation to Carolyn's questions earlier, it seems to me that building and really getting to know the network of cats, so to speak, is really fundamental to laying foundation for maybe getting them all to look at the same mouse or something. And I have jokingly said a few times along the way that one of the best community organizing tools is pizza and beer. Well, I don't think we used it in this case.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think I've had multiple pizzas and beer, maybe not literally pizzas and beer, but definitely like multiple coffees and lunches and sort of just attending casual events that people are having. I think it's important to think of this as a human relationship as much as anything. Like certainly there's task work that needs to be done, but at the end of the day, like there's a group of people and that are working together on something, and people don't want to work with people that they don't get along with. And you also want to feel like that you know someone that you're working with, and like that takes time and it takes experiences for us to really develop those relationships. And if we're only task-centered, then we never really develop those relationships with people. I think that pizza and beer is important, or whatever sort of somebody's implementation of that is, just to get people to know people. And I think getting out there in events, I like to support people's work, and I like to see that, I do the same thing with students. Like I see relationships as being, ideal relationships as being mutually beneficial, right? That people are helping me out and that I'm helping them out as well. And then I'm not constantly asking people for things. But I think one of the side effects of attending other people's events is that that people that don't know me as well see me out there doing the work. And I think that's added to the credibility and being somebody that that has a long-term commitment to this work.
Yeah, I was say, if we're getting to questions about your process, I have a question as maybe more speaks to your prior experiences. I do a fair amount of service work in my university on issues of diversity and recruiting non-traditional students and diverse students, but formerly incarcerated students is not something that I've been in meetings talking about. I'm at a kind of traditional 4-year state university. And I'm wondering, it looks like on your board you have already well in place representatives from technical and community colleges. I'm wondering if you're familiar with similar initiatives at more traditional 4-year institutions.
So the probably longest standing and program that's housed within a university is Project Rebound out of San Francisco State University. It's actually been around for 50 years. They just had their 50th anniversary. It was started by a formerly incarcerated professor at San Francisco State University. They existed as on one campus until about 3 or 4 years ago. And then the Opportunity Institute came in with and worked with Stanford to expand that across the California state system. They're now on 8 campuses. Mm-hmm. They have this program that's housed within the university. It's through their Associated Students Union, but they also have some support from the financial support from the university for those particular programs. And they help people get into the university, help people apply, become admitted, and particularly support them while they're on campus. Another one is the Underground Scholars, which was started at UC Berkeley by a couple of formerly incarcerated students there. They were Project Rebound helped support the development of that program, and then the Opportunity Institute has also helped expand that across the University of California system. I know they're on 2 campuses, and they may be on a 3rd now, but their goal is to expand across the University of California system. And the 3rd one that I mentioned is the College Initiative at CUNY. So that was started as a nonprofit organization, but one of the co-founders was a faculty member at CUNY, and it's since been brought back into CUNY. There are other programs that exist outside of universities, but those are probably the largest ones that are housed within universities.
Great, thanks so much.
And our goal at the University of Washington Tacoma is to develop something similar. I can't say for sure what that'll look like, because I use a similar collaborative participatory process and program development that I do in the research, so I can't really say what that will look like. But we have a group of, we have an administrative steering committee. We have a group of faculty and staff who support transitions from prison to college. And then we have what we call a Husky post-prison pipeline advisory council of formerly incarcerated students and graduates. And so those 3 entities will be coming together to develop a post-prison higher education support program here at the University of Washington Tacoma. Hopefully informed by some of the research, and then informing some of the research through an action research process.
Sounds great.
And so I would probably add to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of credibility, in that this work that I'm doing around program development probably is, it isn't intentionally developed for that purpose of enhancing the credibility of my work, but looking back, that's something that has probably helped me network faster and develop stronger relationships, because I'm not only doing the research, but also doing service work in this area that just sort of helps demonstrate the long-term commitment to this work.
I'm curious if you know of any current projects or resources that specifically focus on helping students transition who are in 2-year or community technical colleges and then transitioning to 4-year universities. So I've been working locally. There's interest in doing something along those lines here for formerly incarcerated students at 2-year schools who are wanting to transition. Do you know if any of these specifically focus on that, or if there's any resources for that?
I would say all those are primarily focused on transitions from community colleges.
Okay.
For a number of different reasons. Mostly because most formerly incarcerated students, it's a much easier pathway to start
Right.
at community college for a number of different reasons.
Okay, great. Thanks.
The ones in California are probably even more centered on community college first, and probably of the California program, I would say that both Underground Scholars and Project Rebound both really emphasize community colleges. Underground Scholars has a community college ambassadors program where they hire students at community colleges who are intending to enroll at UC Berkeley, and then they serve as an ambassador to that community college while they're enrolled there.
Oh, wow.
So the nice thing about that model is that it gives people a job.
Mm-hmm.
They're an ambassador that knows both the university and the community college.
Great.
All right. So we have about 5 minutes left. So if folks have any other questions or comments or anything, I think Chris was just about to invite you in again. So any other final questions or comments? All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chris, for this talk. It was really interesting to hear you present on this, and looks like his information is up there. So if folks have any questions or would like to reach out, please remember that the idea of this learning community is that it doesn't start and end here. I encourage you to reach out to one another in the interim. So thank you all. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much, Chris. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
See you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was really fascinating. So I look forward to seeing what happens with your project in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Chris, I'm not sure of whether this is relevant, but as you were talking, I was thinking about public health strategies and how they may overlap with participatory action research. And I just wonder if have you made any kind of connections with public health here?
Yeah, we have one person in our nursing program that uses CBPAR. Probably uses more of a traditional implementation of CBPAR with sort of more grassroots, lived experience boards. But I think that'll be a good learning experience for me to sort of see what he's doing on the public health side with a little bit different model of CBPAR than what I'm using, and maybe adjusting both of our models along the way.
Yeah. Thanks much. It was good discussion. I'm leaving the meeting.
Good to see you.
Thanks. Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Bye.